Hello and welcome back to History Stuff after a long absence. I haven't done one of these videos for about a year, I think. I got distracted by other things. So in that time, as you'll notice, the 5 or 6 people who followed this channel before will notice that I've got even hairier. I'm now basically a walking beard, a nose, pair of eyes, glasses, and that's it, basically. That's all I am. And this hirsute appearance obviously makes me look more academic, which in turn gives my nonsense, the sort of the weight of truth, of verisimilitude. So you must listen to everything I say. Everything I say is correct. Everything I have to say about history is absolutely 100% correct. Nobody else is got any kind of patch on me, really. I am amazing. Just bear that in mind. That's the truth. Okay. In order to get back into this, as I say, it's been about 12 months since I did one of these videos. I thought I would do a review of a book, recent book by Teresa Cole called Harry of England. And this is basically a series of potted biographies of all the kings of England named Henry, from 1 to 8. I did actually do a written review of this and posted it on social media a couple of days ago. But I thought, more as an exercise as much as anything, I would do a spoken word review to camera to see how that goes. If you're wondering why I'm looking slightly glazed, it's because I'm actually reading off my own review and then adding sort of improvised bits as and when they occur to me. So here we go. Harry of England. It's a new history, as I said, by Teresa Cole, of 8 kings of England named Henry. And the rear of the dust jacket features an interesting quote from a 17th century poem glorifying Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. And this reads, "Oh, when shall such English men with such acts fill a pen, or England breed again such a King Harry?" Well, to judge from this book, England should be very wary of breeding any more King Harrys. Not that they were all flops and failures, but this is essentially one long tale of cruelty, violence, avarice, war, conquest, with an odd period of calm between atrocities. 6 of the 8 Henrys were very forceful, dominant personalities. One was, in my opinion, a bit of a bumbling mediocrity, the other a complete failure. So let's quickly copy the author's example and go through each Henry one at a time. First, appropriately enough, you have Henry I, known as Beauclerk, or Fine Scholar, because he could read, one of the sons of William the Conqueror. I found this opening chapter a little bit disjointed because it's split between very colourful anecdotes of Henry's youthful escapades when he's fighting his brothers. At one point he's really an outlaw, charging about Normandy with a small band of followers, burning towns and throwing people off towers. You have that very sort of action-packed narrative, and then Cole launches into this very sort of sober academic discussion of the creation of the Exchequer and other sort of government and legal departments during Henry's reign as King of England, which seems a bit of an uneven split, and it gives the impression that many of these very worthy, ancient copper-bottomed institutions in England were founded by a man who was essentially a Viking. Henry he comes across as a pirate, really. Which may well be true, but it's interesting to contemplate that. Moving on, the next Henry is Henry I's grandson. This is Henry II, Henry Fitz-Empress, played by Peter O'Toole in Becket and The Lion in Winter, famously. This is a man of really demonic energy. The Devil's Brood, his family were called, from their alleged descent from a witch. And Henry was an extraordinary character, even more so than his grandfather. He stole, essentially, the King of France's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the great beauty celebrities of the day. He puts together this massive empire, the so-called Angevin Empire, that is completely ramshackle and unsustainable, and it starts to fall apart even before he dies, really. But it's still very impressive. For 30 years, Henry rules a kingdom that stretches from the border of Scotland down to the Pyrenees, enormous empire. He's also rather famous for killing Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who will rid me of this turbulent priest, etc., and fighting his own children. But I think he deserves to be remembered for more than that, really. He's perhaps the closest England ever came to having a real a genius on the throne. He was a man, despite his flaws and failures, who possessed enormous energy, intellect, willpower, and was a very hard act to follow. Then we move on to Henry III, um, who is a bit uninspiring in contrast with the previous two Henrys. There have been some recent arguments, very forcefully expressed, that he was actually an underrated king, that he was the great king England never knew it had. Well, lucky old England. Described as a simple and plain king by Dante, Italian poet. To be honest, the account of his reign, through no fault of the authors, is a bit dull by comparison with the previous two. Henry is dominated by his ambitious advisors in the first part of his reign, eventually shrugs them off and goes on to achieve not much, really. He fails in his military efforts to recover the lost lands in France. And then finally agrees to the Treaty of Paris, which is a poisoned chalice, really. This agreement reduces his dynasty to mere vassals of the kings of France, and all they're left with from this once mighty continental empire that Henry II put together is the Duchy of Gascony, this semi-rural province in the far southwest of France. And Henry and his successors, they hang on to this duchy in the face of all the odds, like grim death, really, because there's so much pride at stake. If they lose it, then they really have failed utterly on the continent. So apart from these troubles, Henry's fortunes in England and Wales, they start to collapse from about the middle of his reign onwards, until he famously has to fight a civil war that goes on for years against Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, a so-called founder of democracy in England. Henry eventually wins, or survives is probably a more appropriate term. And to be fair to him, he does get through all of his troubles over a very long reign, about 50 years, and he manages to die in bed, which is very much an achievement for a medieval king. His own bed, incidentally, not someone else's. Next up, we have Henry IV, Bolingbroke. Late 14th century, he kicks his cousin Richard II off the throne and founds the Lancastrian dynasty. Cole describes Henry as a very serious, well-intentioned man who might have made a very good king in less controversial and difficult circumstances. Possibly, he certainly did very well to hang on to his crown, which he had stolen, to be honest, in the teeth of endless plots, wars, rebellions, wars in Wales, France, civil wars in England, wars against Scotland, the usual thing. And he lasts 13 years, dies of a very horrible lingering illness when he's about 46, not very old even by the standards of the time. Possibly psychosomatic to an extent. Henry is possibly laden with guilt because he had usurped his cousin's throne and then had Richard assassinated, starved to death probably. And Cole concludes quite reasonably that Henry probably wished he'd done something else with his life. And next we have the superstar of the Plantagenet dynasty, Henry V, immortalised by Shakespeare. This is a very interesting chapter because Cole doesn't just concentrate on Henry's French wars, the Battle of Agincourt and so forth, which is, tends to hog the limelight of Henry's short reign. He's only 9 years. She also concentrates on his overseas diplomacy, domestic policies. Doesn't try to glamorise Henry as Shakespeare did. The real Henry was a very brutal, cold, wily character, very effective king, but also very ambitious, very driven, ruthless, utterly brutal, as you can see by the way he treated the French citizens of Rouen, for instance, in Normandy. He let them starve to death in a ditch rather than let them through his lines. And Cole also makes the interesting point that Henry's war taxes were causing serious problems in England even before he died very prematurely of dysentery, aged about 36. which gives rise to the possibility that if he had lived another 20 years or so, which he might, reasonably have expected, and continued to pump everything into the conquest of France, milking England of cash for this mirage, this chimera of conquering France, which his dynasty are obsessed with by this point, England may have collapsed into civil war even sooner than it did. So that brings us on to Henry VI, who is a complete and utter catastrophe. Poor man, totally unsuited to the job that he was born into, incapable of sustaining his father's legacy, controlling the factions at court, or doing anything very much. He's just one of these sort of genetic misfires who should never have been king and would have probably been a lot happier as a monk because he's very pious. The account of his reign is quite depressing. It's one long disaster, both in England and France. Henry's administration is a catastrophe. He loses all the lands in France. England collapses into civil war, the Wars of the Roses as we think of them. Henry himself suffers from mental illness. At one point he seems to goes into a sort of catatonic stupor and stays there for over a year. To be honest, I don't blame him, considering what he's got to deal with. You get the impression that the pressures, these unbearable pressures, just got too much, and he sort of withdrew into himself in the hope that it would all go away. It's psychologically quite interesting. And eventually, when the poor man is murdered, as he was, by Yorkist assassins, they clubbed him to death while he was praying, which is nice. It was probably a merciful release, really. You can only pity Henry, really. And then we get on to Henry VII, the usurper, the Welsh usurper, who founds the Tudor dynasty, defeats Richard III at Bosworth, and puts an end to the Plantagenet line of kings in England. Henry is not a very popular character generally. He's seen as a miser, a skinflint, a usurper, but I actually found him something of a relief from all the disasters and failures of the previous reign. He's actually very capable. He survives, which is the main thing for a usurper. He navigates his way through all these wars and conflicts and trials, the usual thing that kings of England are apparently doomed to have to contend with. And he sees them all off. With a very shrewd touch. He's no fool, Henry. He comes across one of the most intelligent, perceptive of kings of England. He's not particularly glamorous, perhaps, although, as sort of Cole argues, it's a strange that the judgments, some of the more extreme, harsher judgments on Henry VII are quite odd. I mean, you're talking about a man who accumulated a lot of wealth, and sometimes did it by quite ruthless means, but what's new? It's not as if his predecessors were innocents in that regard. He refused to fight silly wars. I mean, he does get involved in some limited wars in France and Brittany and Scotland, but they're very cagey operations, and he pulls out when it's clear that he's achieved everything he's going to achieve. In France, for instance, he allows himself to be bought off. The French simply give him a load of money and he goes away, which is pretty much all he was angling for. That's all he wanted. And if you're going to fight a war, then you might as well be sensible about it. So yeah, I was quite impressed with Cole's account of Henry VII. I quite liked him. And then we get on to Henry VIII, the most famous of the lot, probably the most famous king of England. He's been endlessly portrayed on screen by Charles Laughton, Jonathan Rhys-Myers, all sorts of people. Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Charles Dickens, in his History of England, he described Henry VIII as one of the worst of men, one of the worst villains to ever draw breath. And I think it was a blot of grease and blood upon the history of England. Cole doesn't seem to disagree too much with that assessment, and I don't either, really, because even compared to his forebears and all the things they got up to, there is still something especially nasty and repellent about the 8th Henry. It's not that he was unsuccessful. I mean, he does achieve certain things like the involvement of the Royal Navy. England continues to prosper, at least financially, during his reign, but his own actions, his personality, it made me wince, to be honest. I mean, in my written review, I described him as this preposterous, swaggering ego, disloyal to everyone and everything except his own interests. He's got this awful habit of killing his friends and previous loyal advisors, like Thomas Cromwell. He would have executed Cardinal Wolsey if the poor old chap hadn't died on the way to his trial. I mean, Henry is a man and a ruler who would go to any extreme. He'd do absolutely anything just to serve his own ambitions and his sort of bloated sense of self. And then, of course, there's the treatment of his wives, which, particularly the first two, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, is just disgusting, to be honest. I mean, there is nothing good to be said about the way he disposed of his first two wives. And when he finally dies, this bloated, stinking tyrant with a great hole in his leg, weeping pus, I was quite relieved. It was almost like the inner wickedness and evil of this man had sort of had come out physically. You could see in what had happened to him as a physical sort of entity, just how revolting he was, really. And that's it. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this book, as I said in my written review. To try and condense 8 very turbulent reigns in just under 300 pages is a very difficult task. I wouldn't like to try and do it, because I would, you know, what do you leave out? But Teresa Cole has done a very admirable job to synthesize these reigns. And I'll end on my weak little joke in my review. Perhaps, you know, an easier sequel would be on English kings named John, because that would be, you know, a great saving on paper. Okay, that's it. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.